Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny. The Tenpenny Files has daily conversations meant to inform and educate, not just to entertain. I come prepared and let the discussion unfold naturally with people worth hearing on topics worth exploring. If it matters to your body, your freedom, or your future, we talk about it here. Each day, I talk with authors, documentary filmmakers, and independent thinkers whose work challenges mainstream messaging. We cover a wide range of topics, so we have something for everyone. We talk about government, politics, medicine, astronomy, pets, travel, food, farming, and fitness, vaccines, vaccine policy, and health policy. We also have conversations once a week with an author who or a pastor who writes about faith and biblical principles. My goal is to introduce you to topics that you've never heard of before and have always wanted to explore but didn't know where to start. Let our guests show you the way through the work that they've already done to take you to deeper study and understanding. Join me every day, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the Tenpenny Files to hear from voices that have often been ignored, silenced, or censored, but have truly something important to say. And I want to invite all of you, everyone who's listening, to become a Tenpenny Prime member. You get exclusive content every month and an Ask the Expert masterclass that they are just over the moon. I bring you the best experts to have one-on-ones with that you can get your questions answered. To learn more, go to primemembership.drtenpenny.com, primembership.drtenpenny.com. Hopefully that you will join and support our work. And one last thing, I want to thank everyone who's been following our channel for a while and sharing our podcast with other people. And welcome to the new people who are hearing us for the first time. So now with that, let's get started. Today's conversation is with physician, molecular geneticist, and award-winning researcher, Dr. Michael Nehls, to discuss his best-selling book, The Indoctrinated Brain: How to Successfully Fend Off the Global Attack on Your Mental Freedom. This book offers a groundbreaking explanation for why mental health disorders are exploding today, and more importantly, what we must do to stop it. Dr. Nehls, it is such a pleasure to finally have you on the show. We've been chasing each other for months now to try to get a coordinated time where we could actually have this conversation. So I'm so grateful to have you on the show here today.
Yeah, Dr. T, if I might call you this. It's a pleasure. The pleasure's all mine. I mean, I'm very grateful that you invited me, and that it was so difficult to find a time is just speaks for ourselves. You know, we are both pretty busy trying to educate the people, and you're doing a great job, and I try to do my best. So, thankfully, we are here together now.
Absolutely. You know, your book, The Indoctrinated Brain, argues that modern society was shaped by a coordinated system of fear, propaganda, and biological psychological stressors used to impair the brain, specifically the hippocampus, which governs memory, identity, and independent thinking. How does weakening the memory change a person's ability to think independently?
Well, the hippocampus, as you already detailed, is the center of our autobiographical memory. This is pretty much the area of our brain. By the way, hippocampus means seahorse shaped, so it's shaped like a seahorse. It's a very ancient structure in our brain. Here in the hippocampus, we have two of them, about the size of a thumb, and they are here in the temporal lobes of the brain. They are very old. They record everything in time and place that we have experienced, but also our future plans are essentially stored there. So what we think, what we have thought, what other people have told us, all the narratives are essentially stored there, primarily because the hippocampus has this unique feature that everything that we hear only once or experience only once, or every thought that we only have once is stored immediately and for long term. And without that, we would not be able to recognize ourselves. The extreme example is Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, the first area of the brain that gets distracted in Alzheimer's is the hippocampus. That's why, for example, I call it hippocampal dementia. So the hippocampus is the prime part of our brain required for thinking. It is also the prime part for human curiosity. and for psychological resilience. And based on all the functionalities that I was able to attribute to the hippocampus, I termed the hippocampus also our mental immune system. And this is quite easily explained. We have a physical immune system that fights against pathogenic microorganisms, and the mental immune system, pretty much coordinated by the hippocampal functions, is the mental immune system fighting, macroscopic pathogens. Usually they come on two legs, and is also, of course, warding off or narratives that are toxic to us, maybe dangerous to us. One has to imagine that we live on narratives. Humans are, talking monkeys in a way. We are experiencing our life through through stories. We love stories. Children love stories. Adult people love stories. Elderly people love stories. We learn from others through stories. We are social super machines in learning, and it's always based on stories, which we call narratives. And some narratives help us. The experience of elderly people help us to get better through life. Their life experience stored through the hippocampus is important for our well-being. And actually, the reason why we can age beyond the age of 45, 50 years compared to, for example, chimpanzees is the evolution of the grandmother, as I call it. It was actually shown that that if the grandmother is in the family, a grandmother let's say the age 50, 55, already not able to give birth by herself anymore, the typical grandmother, if the grandmother is existing in a family, it was shown until the end of the 19th century, for every decade compared to a family where the grandmother is missing, two grandchildren more became adults.
Hmm.
So her life experience and her ability to help the family allowed the family to have more children and more grandchildren from her perspective to become adults. So her genes were transmitted to the next generation and even to the generation behind her, beyond her own children. And this, let's say, evolutionary advantage, which supports old age but also experience, is the reason we age way higher, longer than chimpanzees, for example, which die usually in the age of 50, despite that they have the same biology in a way that we have until the age of 50, but then their life experience is over because our ability to speak and to learn from language and give the information to the next and even the transgenerationally to the generation beyond the next generation is so important in humans. And this, by the way, the main reason I wrote many books, even the Indoctrinated Brain, showing that Alzheimer's is not natural. Alzheimer's is quite contrary to the evolution of the grandmother, because if it would be natural to become an Alzheimer patient with 60, 65, 70 years old, then the evolution of the grandmother would never have happened. Yeah, so this is a very natural explanation that Alzheimer is unnatural. And coming back to your question, without the hippocampus, we would not be able to even remember our own thoughts. So thinking is dependent on a functioning hippocampus, and in a total, it's depending on a functioning mental immune system. I would even go so far and say what makes us human depends on the function of the mental immune system.
That's really fascinating. It's really, really fascinating. I don't think that people really understand that. So thanks for bringing that out. You know, your book describes a two-step indoctrination process. Break the brain with fear, stress, or the bioweapon, and replace thinking with a narrative designed by the elite and those that want to control us. Which step do you think is more critical to the destruction of the brain? Is it more breaking the brain and with fear and stress, or is it more the implantation of the indoctrination?
Well, it's a two-step process. One doesn't go without the other. So the main function of the mental immune system is to ward off toxic narratives, so that we have the mental ability to differentiate between stories that are useful for us and help us to get to move along with life, maybe in a better way. And then there are narratives which harm us. For example, the narrative that vaccination with an mRNA, with mod mRNA is helpful, or that vitamin D doesn't help us. These are narratives which have been very toxic and killed many people. So and destructed even the society, divided the society. These are toxic narratives, and with a healthy mental immune system, you would realize there's something wrong, and you would be curious. Part of the mental immune system is curiosity. You would be curious. You would be open to new ideas because you don't fear new ideas because you have a very strong mental or psychological resilience. So the first step is, of course, the destruction of the mental immune system. Otherwise, you would be more resistant to such toxic ideas. You would not be indoctrinated so easily if your mental immune system would be functioning. So the mental immune system, even though it's an old structure, and one would believe it's a very sturdy structure because it's one of the oldest structures in our brain, but in order to function, which I show in my book, it requires the production of new nerve cells on a daily basis. Actually, the hippocampus is the only structure in our brain which is able to produce new nerve cells up to the highest age, in accordance with the evolution of the grandmother. These new cells, which are produced every day in the hippocampus, are required for resilience. They are required for curiosity. They're actually the neuronal correlate for curiosity. If you destruct these cells, curiosity is gone. If you destruct these cells, you have no resilience and you tend to become depressed or led by anxiety. And these new nerve cells have the function also to act as index neurons for new memories. So if these cells are not produced, new memories cannot be formed without destructing older memories. So if your memory capacity is exhausted and new nerve cells are available, then new ideas, if they manage to get into the hippocampus, they will actually override previous ideas or previous memories. So though it's a two-step process. The first step, of course, is to destroy the production of new nerve cells. And then, of course, new ideas will be unfiltered for your brain. They cannot be judged against previous memories. You are more easily led by fear. Fear will lead to emotions that tend to support the implantation of the thoughts, the narratives into your brain. And this combination leads to a situation where the new narrative become part of yourself. So your old self will be gradually destroyed by the narratives that are implanted, and then the new narrative essentially becomes your new self. And this combination is, of course, problematic because you are first not open to new thoughts anymore. Everybody who challenges this, let's say, toxic narrative, which became part of yourself, is regarded as somebody who invades my privacy, who because you don't discuss the narrative anymore as a neutral idea because it's part of yourself. It's almost like you step on other people's toes once you discuss actually just science. It's not science anymore. You discuss personalities. And this is a real problem, but it was the basic idea which let me realize the story behind that, the scientific story behind that, because I experienced this even in my family. Some family members, unfortunately the close ones, have understood the same thing that I understood, but they also take care of the hippocampus like I do. But there are other parts, for example, in my family, more extended part of my family who don't listen to my understanding how we can make sure that the hippocampus is happy. And though their hippocampus is not so happy, but they believe it's just normal how they feel. And once such bad narratives come, they actually ingest them. They become part of themselves, and these new narratives are then their dogma, and you cannot talk to them anymore. And this is what I experienced, and I wanted to understand why. And because I was working on the understanding how Alzheimer's comes about, and I published my ideas as a unified theory of Alzheimer's in 2016 as a research paper. From this basic understanding, it became clear to me how indoctrination happened, particularly through the measurements, to the stuff that the government did to us in 2020.
You mentioned in passing there, you said you take care of your hippocampus. How do we take care of our hippocampus?
Well, it's the same idea that I already published in the Unified Theory paper, and also in my book, for example, The Exhausted Brain, which has also been published in 2025 now. It's the predecessor of the Indoctrinated Brain. It's the Exhausted Brain. It shows why we are exhausted in the evening when we have worked hard and why we recover the next morning. It all has to do with that these new nerve cells are produced while we are sleeping in large quantities, and that's why our brain is refreshed when we are waking up in the morning. And of course, based on the circumstance that the hippocampus is producing new nerve cells, he actually has the ability to grow as we age, about 1 to 2% by volume each year. But the reality is it's not growing in our society. On average, it's shrinking. The hippocampus shrinks by 1.4% volume percent each year in our society. And so, what is the reason for that? In my paper, Unified Theory, I identified that all the risk factors that we know about Alzheimer's all converge on on the mechanism, meaning they stop the production of new nerve cells, being it toxins, which I call it the law of the maximum. Certain things are not allowed up to a certain threshold, and if we are above this threshold, then the production of new nerve cells ceases, or the law of the minimum, which means our brain, like every cell in our body, of course, but particularly also our brain, needs a certain requirement, has a certain requirement of minima, things that have to be there at a minimum level, being it trace elements, vitamins, but also a daily hug, a minimum of curiosity each day, a sense of a purpose in life, a certain amount of physical activity, or at least a certain amount of social activity. If any of these minima that we are required for mental health is missing, then these cells don't grow. So it's actually astonishing that the part of our brain that makes us human, that gives us all the abilities that detail what humans are, the mental immune system is at the one side our strongest weapon to survive. At the same time, it's the weakest spot in our brain because it is dependent on the production of new nerve cells.
Do you think that with the COVID-19 jab, we know that the spike protein and probably the lipid nanoparticles and other things that were in the ingredients in that jab, that we still don't know everything that was there. And we know that they did cross the blood-brain barrier. Do you think that they specifically attacked the hippocampus, or was this more of a global event as it crossed the blood-brain barrier?
I think it was done on purpose. But it's just a belief. I don't have of course, I can't prove that, but there are so many coincidences that it makes it hard for me to believe it's not on purpose. So first of all, SARS-CoV-1, in 2001, 2002, which tried to become a pandemic, but of course didn't have the support of a broad PCR assay. When it tried to become a pandemic, it was clear for the few people who have been infected that the spike protein is able to trigger what we call a neuroinflammation, inflammation of the brain. And in my Alzheimer's research, I could show that the production of new nerve cells is immediately stopped if neuroinflammation is started. So neuroinflammation stops the production of new nerve cells. We call this sickness behavior. Some people call it now long COVID or post-vac. But the point is, once the production of new nerve cells is shut down, we don't feel like socializing. We lose our natural curiosity. We like to remove ourselves from society. Best we go into in our bed and sleep. Don't want to leave the bed. And why? Sickness behavior is healthy because neuroinflammation has a cause. One cause could be I was hit on my head, I have brain injury, and of course, in this situation, it's better to stay in bed. Or I have an infection, which means I have an inflammation in my brain, which also transpires into the brain. Neuroinflammation makes sure that I don't mingle with other people, infect them, and that I go back and stay on my own and recover and, don't harm society. So for short term, this is a good thing. In the long term, of course, it harms the hippocampus and leads to its shrinkage. So in 2006, a paper was published that the spike protein of SARS-CoV-1, of course, at the time it was just SARS-CoV, nobody knew that SARS-CoV-2 will be coming, but SARS-CoV-1 was able to harm the hippocampus. And when that was published, I was intrigued when the Nobel Prize winner in 2023, for the mRNA idea, were telling us that they had the idea 15 years ago, which was pretty much the time when it was shown that a spike protein can harm the hippocampus and destroy our mental immune system. So for me, it was totally clear that this is not a coincidence. If you know for 15 years that you develop a technology that introduces a spike protein into the brain, particularly that the furin cleavage site that was introduced by the Wuhan lab or by ideas from EcoHealth Alliance, in combination with or with support of the DARPA of the United States. When the furin cleavage site was introduced, it was clear that now the spike protein, the dangerous part of the spike protein, the S1 subunit, after the molecular cleavage of the spike protein in two parts, S1, S2, and the S1 is interacting in the brain with the receptor of the immune cells in the brain. And this receptor is called TLR4. And once this receptor recognizes the S1 subunit, it triggers immediately a strong neuroinflammatory response. And if the spike protein stays for long term in the brain, then of course we have a lengthy neuroinflammatory process. And this lengthy neuroinflammatory process, of course, shuts down the mental immune system permanently. And so that's the step one that we talked about. You essentially stop the mental immune system from functioning. You don't produce new, what I call index neurons, that are important for remembering new stuff. And so then you are punished essentially every day in the mainstream media with new ideas, what is so dangerous. And if you leave the house at 8 o'clock in the evening, then it's particularly dangerous. And if you do it, then you get you might end up in prison. So all this information that is so important to survive in such a time becomes now suddenly part of yourself, because you cannot differentiate these thoughts with previous thoughts because you don't have these new nerve cells that help you to differentiate.
No.
And so the second step requires the first step. And the first step, the spike protein, but also the measures in 2020 were already part of that. And in my book, I actually compare these measures with which was learned during the Korean War, from prisoners of war. It was published in 1956 that certain prisoners, Navy pilots from the US Air Force, were essentially indoctrinated by the Chinese government to become communists, and that was really strange. They were fighting essentially for capitalism and democracy and became communists. And the American government the military, of course, tried to understand what happened there, and they published in 1956 their results and showed how this indoctrination process worked. And I was able to compare this indoctrination process, which with what was done with essentially society worldwide, and it's like one to one. It's pretty much every detail of this plan that the United States learned about was essentially transformed to a global attack on the mental capacity of the people.
Yeah. Well, whew, that's a whole lot to take in and to digest, because it's so important to understand what happened during COVID, because I think that people still are a little bit blind to that. So I think this is a good place for us to take a quick station break. So hold that thought right there, Dr. Michael. We're going to take a short break to hear from our sponsors at AmericaOutloud.news. America Out Loud Radio plays the Tenpenny Files on iHeartRadio Network daily, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can also listen anywhere in the world by going to AmericaOutloud.news and listening through their media player. If you've missed any of these great conversations, you can find the Tenpenny Files on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, iTunes, TuneIn, iHeart Virtual Studio, and on my platforms, which are drtenpenny.com, where you go there and click on the podcast tab. A drop-down window will come down. You'll see where it says all podcasts. You can find every podcast there. We also post them on my Substack, drtenpenny.substack.com, and on X, Instagram, and Rumble. There's so many great books and documentaries and so little time to read and watch in our terribly busy lives. This show is meant to jumpstart your interest and hopefully maximize your time. So we have got a great message coming from several of our sponsors. Listen closely, sit tight. We will be right back with more from Dr. Michael Nehls discussing the indoctrinated brain, how to successfully fend off the global attack on your mental freedom. We will be right back. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out, the heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to drtenpenny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words: many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, our conversation is with physician, molecular geneticist, and award-winning researcher, Dr. Michael Nehls, discussing his book, the best-selling book. Honestly, everybody should read this if you haven't already. The Indoctrinated Brain, How to Successfully Fend Off the Global Attack on Your Mental Freedom. The book exposes a shattering change of circumstantial evidence that target our individually during the COVID debacle, I guess we would call it. Let me tell you just a little bit more about today's guest. Dr. Michael Nehls is a physician and a molecular geneticist. Why am I stumbling over that word today? Specializing in immunology. He deciphered the genetic causes of dozens of diseases at international research institutions. His discovery of a key gene in immunity development was honored as a pillar of immunology. For his pioneering findings on Alzheimer's disease, he was awarded the Hans Prize for Molecular Psychiatry by the Rostock University Hospital. Dr. Nehls has written several best-selling books. One is on the importance of lithium, and we're going to have him back a little bit later this year to talk about that. I've started to read through that, and it is another fascinating dissertation on his great research into the brain. Dr. Nehls, welcome back to the show. We're so glad to have you here today.
Dr. T, thank you very much for having me back.
During COVID, one of the things we talked about a lot, and I talked about it a lot on this show and when I was guest on another show, is how they learned how to weaponize fear. Do you think what is more detrimental to the hippocampus and to the brain in general, the intensity of the fear or the duration of the fear?
Well, actually, I have a slide on that, or a figure actually in the book. I think it's a mixture of both at the end. I mean, short fear is certainly not a big problem because our brain can compensate for that. Actually, we learn by fear. It's not a bad thing. The long-term fear is a huge problem if fear doesn't disappear. So if the danger doesn't disappear, or if we don't find a solution against the danger. Because fear triggers, of course, our brain in particular our mental immune system, which we have discussed already, to find solutions. Either we find them ourselves or we find them through people around us. We are social learning animals and we learn quickly and efficiently. And so there's usually somebody somewhere who has an idea how to solve a problem. I mean, we are not alone, So I think this is very important. But constant fear that is not resolved, of course, is detrimental to the brain. It leads to a neuroinflammation because nerve cells that are overloaded by activity exudate essentially products which are usually in the cell to the outside. These products are recognized by the immune cells of our brain. They're called microglia, and these immune cells recognize these products as danger-associated molecular patterns. DAMs, their abbreviation, danger-associated molecular patterns, which are very closely related by their function to the so-called pathogen-associated molecular patterns, meaning PAMs. One of the PAMs we talked about already is the spike from SARS-CoV-2. Spike protein from SARS-CoV-2 is a so-called PAMP, pathogen-associated molecular pattern recognized by TLR4, triggering neuroinflammation. Danger-associated molecular patterns or damage-associated molecular patterns, which are identical, both have a D, so it it can be exchanged. But the point is, words can be almost like a physical hits against the brain. Words could be really like strokes against the brain. And so if in both cases they trigger damage to brain cells, the exudation of DAMs recognized by the same receptor that recognizes PAMs. So again, TLR4 is triggered, activating these cells to produce a strong neuroinflammatory response. So constant fear leads to constant production of DAMs, leads to constant neuroinflammation, and then we enter a vicious cycle because neuroinflammation cuts down the production of new nerve cells in the hippocampus, which are the neuronal correlate for psychological resilience. So if this is cut down, our psychological resilience goes down, and we are even more fearful and even more stressed out if circumstances are changing or not changing if we live in a fearful environment. And this means we have a vicious cycle. And it's very hard for people to leave this cycle, and actually they need the help from others. Otherwise, it's not possible. And one of the triggers that I introduced very early on to leave this vicious cycle of neuroinflammation is a word you already mentioned. It's lithium. Lithium is a natural antidote for this vicious cycle.
Wow. It seems as though that so many people are incapable of seeing what the jabs have done to society. They're not willing to admit that they even caused any harm. I spoke at a conference this last weekend, and people were still talking about that their children will not speak to them because of their position on not getting a COVID-19 jab. And it seems as though there's people were able to see it clearly, and other people just bought into the indoctrination that is caused continual disruption of people just based on a medical product. Is this brain indoctrination that people experienced during COVID, that you must take the jab and you're protecting grandma and you must travel and all the excuses that people came up with, is this indoctrination reversible?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We know it's reversible because I was just talking about these pilots in the Korean War. Actually, some returned. They were indoctrinated, heavily indoctrinated by the communist idea, but some actually returned to the United States. And after a few months, a year, this indoctrination essentially reversed. As long as we are in contact with others, there's always the possibility. But what I think is very important is that you restart the production of new nerve cells in the hippocampus. It's very important so that you are open to new ideas, new thoughts, and this is critical. For example, in the United States, there is vaccination now available, I think since 2021. It's also available now in Germany or Europe since 2025. It's a vaccination against Alzheimer's. It's very, very dangerous. It's also a very bad narrative that this injection of antibodies, it's an immunization against Alzheimer, would be helpful. It's based on a theory that is completely contrary to my unified theory that a single molecule in the brain that we actually inherit, is part of our genetic program, is causing Alzheimer's. And we have to essentially attack this protein. And I come to the point immediately. This protein is required that the hippocampus can work. So we need this protein, it's called beta amyloid. We need this protein for the synapses in our hippocampus to form new memories and to protect these memories once they are formed. So, and this protein now is now the target for Alzheimer's therapy, that you attack this protein by antibodies, and the Mayo Clinic, or Mayo Clinic, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, the Mayo Clinic in the United States, you see a fact sheet on the side effects of these antibodies. And one major side effect is that false beliefs cannot be corrected anymore by information.
Wow.
So once you're indoctrinated and you get this Alzheimer's therapy, you are permanently indoctrinated, meaning you can, change the indoctrination by new facts, but your hippocampus must be functioning. And so I'm coming back to the question that you asked me before. Maybe I answered it not correctly or not fully. You asked me what I do to protect my hippocampus. And based on the unified theory of Alzheimer's disease, everything that allows my hippocampal neuronal cells to be produced, it's called adult hippocampal neurogenesis. That's a technical term. Adult because I'm an adult, it's still happening in my brain. It happens even if I'm 80 or 90 years old. The production rate is still pretty much the rate of an 18-year-old. So it's a very important function. Mental immune system must work until the highest age based on the evolution of the grandmother. So every risk factor that I could identify that is touted as the risk factor against Alzheimer's, once it's I don't know, radiation from mobile phones. Next time it's I don't know, plastic stuff, or it's other toxins, or it's lack of vitamin D, or lack of whatever. All these factors converge that they limit the production of new nerve cells in the hippocampus. And so it's very simple. In order to make sure that I never experience Alzheimer's, I just have to remove these risk factors or reduce them as much as I can. And it's very easy to understand. There's the law of the minimum, which I already mentioned, and the law of the maximum. Law of the minimum means everything that my brain requires, I have to give the brain. And if one thing is missing, it doesn't help me if I add twice the amount of something else. So if my brain requires, for example, lithium, which is an essential trace element, I can eat as much potassium, magnesium, or whatever. It doesn't help me. The lithium is missing, and I have a problem. Actually, that lithium is an essential trace element was published not only in my unified theory and now in my new book, but it was also published on August 6, 2025 by Harvard University in Nature. They showed that maybe the lack of lithium as an essential trace element is maybe one of the major causes of Alzheimer's, which I described already 10 years ago. And it's in all of my books. So that's the law of the minimum. Once you made sure that nothing is missing based on the law of the minimum, then you can essentially attack the law of the maximum. You can look at what toxins might actually cause my brain not working right. It could be many things. But once you have covered the law of the minimum, then you are more able to compensate for toxins. Yeah. So the law of the minimum is the leading law. Very important to know. So because it's impossible for us to omit all toxins. I mean, it's just impossible. We have to use maybe a mobile phone and radiation, which is not good for my brain. But I can endure a certain amount because I don't lack any minima. There's nothing missing that the brain needs to function at all. There are actually studies out there, for example, in Inuit, people who live in the north of Greenland. They, for example, eat fish. Their main food is fish. And fish, we know, is full of a lot of toxins, meanwhile. And so we know these toxins cause Alzheimer's. But because the fish contains pretty much everything that the brain needs, it fulfills the law of the minimum. And it was identified that Inuits who eat traditionally, of course, have a lot of toxins in their brain, mercury and other stuff that is not healthy for the brain, but they don't develop Alzheimer's. Why? Because the law of the minimum is fulfilled. So the law of the minimum is what we need so that the brain can work and grow, particularly the hippocampus can grow our whole life. And then, of course, we have the mental capacity to reduce every other thing that comes from the law of the maximum. And one thing that the law of the maximum certainly has to recognize is that we don't need any spike protein in our brain. So once the law of the minimum and the functioning mental immune system tells me the spike protein in my brain is not a good thing, I certainly are not willing to get a shot.
So give us a little bit of teaser about your new book on the lithium. And I think that you're probably referring to like lithium orotate in like small doses, as opposed to like the prescription level lithium at like very high doses that could be quite toxic to people. Give us a little teaser about what your new book on a lithium is about.
Well, you already described it in a certain way. What I was able to show is that lithium is probably one of the oldest trace elements that living cells are actually using. There's not a single function in our cells that is not dependent on the presence of lithium. Actually, without lithium, life would not be possible. So it fulfills all criteria of an essential trace element. Certain functions are so important that they are so old. I was able to trace their function back to the first living matter on our planet. It's very clear that the unified, it's called universal common ancestor. That's the word. Last universal common ancestor, Luca. It was published recently in Nature. He lived maybe 4.2 billion years ago on this planet. And I was able that all species that live on this planet, bacteria, insects, plants, tomatoes, what you name it, every animal, every species, every plant, every human, all have certain mechanisms in their cells that are common to all of them. And these common mechanisms, two of them which are critical for life, to sustain life and to live a healthy life, are dependent on lithium. So it's totally clear lithium is an essential trace element. And I know that we have, if a lack of lithium will affect how we live. It is one of the major causes of chronic diseases, particularly diseases of the brain. So one mechanism that is so ancient is what we call the mechanism of autophagy, the ability to eat ourselves, meaning naturally that cell products like mitochondria or proteins which are dysfunctional are essentially eaten up by the cell, recycled, and used. The material is used to produce new proteins and new mitochondria. So mitochondriophagy is correlated or is in concert with mitochondria genesis, producing new mitochondria. And this process is triggered by a protein called inositol monophosphatase, and this protein is requiring lithium to function. And it's also a basic mechanism against viral invasion. It's because it's the oldest mechanism, natural mechanism that cells have to fight incoming viruses. Because if a virus enters a cell, it usually takes over the cellular machinery to reproduce itself, but the mechanism of autophagy can be used to just digest the virus and recycle its parts. So there's a competition essentially between viruses and autophagy. And this is an explanation why when you take lithium, you are less prone to infection. Actually, it was shown that people who have a severe infection with COVID, severe enough that they had to go to an hospital, and it was not clear if they had to go to intensive care, if they had to go on a machine for breathing. If they were given lithium, they were out of the hospital in half the time. So this is published in 2022, but it was already known that it works in 2020. It was published in August 2020, peer-reviewed. But nobody, of course, cared. Nobody was interested in that. I published a book about this. So lithium is highly essential, particularly the autophagy is very important because brain cells need to be able to recycle their cellular components for 100 years. Because we can get 100 years, we can become 100-year-old. And nerve cells that have been created when we are born still have to function when we are 100 years old. And the only way they can do that is by autophagy. And that the exterior of the cell is maintained because the synapses, sometimes with 10,000 of other nerve cells, are what we are. They store information about ourselves, about our behavior, about our memories. And but the interior of the cell would essentially compromise its function if autophagy wouldn't work. And this is one of the reasons that lithium, as a trigger for autophagy and cell survival, is so important. And that was known already since the 1970s because studies were published at that time which showed that if you are lucky enough to live in an area where a little bit more of lithium is in your tap water, you are less prone to develop Alzheimer's.
Wow. Well, Michael, we've got like 1 minute left here in our show today. And if you noticed me looking down periodically while we were talking, it was because I was taking notes on the things you were saying because they were so important. And the way that you said them were so resonated and easy to understand. We're in the last minute or so of our show here. Why should people buy your book and where can they get it?
Well, the book is available in every bookstore, I hope. At least you can get it over the internet. And why should they get it? Well, they can listen to me here and maybe they understand what I'm talking about. But once you read a book, you have a deep understanding. Once you have a deep understanding, you are more than just a consummate of the information. You become an, a crystallization point for others for this information because you can give it to others with a strong understanding. And it's very important that everybody who listens to us here becomes somebody who can propagate the ideas that I have written about because it's so important to educate the society.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much for your work, for your brilliance, for being able to take this very complex information and boil it down into bite-sized bits that general people can understand it and be able to apply it. And I'm looking forward to having you back again so we can really dive deep into your book on lithium. You just left a little tease out there, and I think that's really great. But the indoctrinated brain really is the core source of what happened to us during COVID and why we can never let this happen again. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank everybody who joined us and listening to us today or in the future on this very important topic of the indoctrinated brain with Dr. Michael Nehls. So I want to close out with one of my favorite verses from the Bible. I close all of my podcasts with, whether it is live or pre-recorded, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. Lean into God, trust him for everything. He will never let you down. Even though your time frame may not be his time frame, he's always with you. So I will see you tomorrow or the next time right here on the Tenpenny Files on AmericaOutloud.news, iHeartRadio, and a podcast platform that you would subscribe to, or go to drtenpenny.com on the podcast tab and you can find everything there. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you for being here again, Michael. Goodbye, everybody, and God bless.